They called me a tired old man who'd embarrassed the family at the wedding. They said it in Italian, 3 feet from my chair, sipping the same wine I'd paid $200 a bottle for, and they thought I was just another deaf retiree from Ohio who wouldn't catch a single word. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 11 years of my career running a logistics office in Milan. My late wife, Joanne, was the daughter of a Sicilian baker from Queens. I'd been listening to Italian over breakfast for 42 years before she passed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Donovan Reese. I'm 67 years old. I live in a brick colonial in Worthington, Ohio, on a quiet street where most of my neighbors have known me since the Reagan administration. I drive a 2014 Buick. I drink coffee from the same diner every Wednesday morning. I'm the kind of man you walk past on the sidewalk and never think twice about, and that, I've come to learn, is the exact reason people make mistakes around me. My grandson, Hayden, is my whole world. His mother, my daughter Bridget, raised him alone after her husband Mike died in a car accident on I-71 when Hayden was 9. I drove down to Columbus every weekend for the next 6 years. I taught the boy to ride a bike at 11, to drive at 16, to fix the radiator in his beat-up Civic at 19. He went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and a small trust I'd put aside the day he was born. He graduated with honors in mechanical engineering and got hired by an aerospace firm in Cincinnati. And then, 2 years ago, he met Julia Marchetti Vance, 26 years old, bottle blonde, fluent in 3 languages, the only daughter of Roberto and Francesca Marchetti Vance of Greenwich, Connecticut. Her father, as I would later learn, ran a private equity firm that had quietly bought up half of a small machine tool industry across the Midwest. Her mother was from Bologna originally, married into old American money, and never let anyone forget either side of that ledger. The first time I met them was at the engagement party. Hayden had insisted I come, and Bridget too, though she'd been hesitant. "Dad," she told me on the phone, "they're not like us. Just be ready for that." I told her I'd be fine. I'd lived in Milan. I'd done business with Germans, Brazilians, Saudis, and men who could buy and sell a small town before lunch. I'd been to plenty of rooms where I wasn't the wealthiest person there. It didn't bother me. It hadn't bothered me in decades. The engagement party was at the Marchetti Vance house in Greenwich. I drove out from Ohio with Bridget. The driveway alone was longer than my street. The house had columns, real ones, not the stick-on kind you see on new builds in the suburbs. There was a fountain. A man in a vest took my keys. Roberto met us at the door. Tall, silver at the temples, the kind of handshake that's just a little too firm, like he's checking to see if you'll wince. Francesca came out behind him wearing pearls the size of grapes. She gave Bridget the kind of once-over you'd give a piece of furniture you were thinking about returning. To me, she gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Donovan," she said, "Hayden has told us so much about you." "All good things, I hope," I said. She just smiled wider. They walked us through to the back garden. 20-some people, mostly her family, mostly speaking Italian among themselves. Hayden spotted me and came across the lawn like a man being rescued from drowning. He hugged me tight. "Grandpa," he whispered, "I'm so glad you're here." I patted his back. "You holding up, kiddo?" He didn't answer that. He just smiled and led me toward the bar. Julia floated over a minute later. She was beautiful. I won't pretend otherwise. She kissed my cheek and said, "We're so happy you came all this way." Then she steered Hayden toward her mother, and I was left holding a glass of Prosecco next to a man I didn't know. The man turned out to be Roberto's brother, Carlo. He was polite enough. He asked where I'd flown in from. I told him I'd driven. His eyebrows went up half an inch. "From Ohio?" "It's not that far," I said. And he said, and that was the end of the conversation. I spent most of the night near the koi pond at the edge of the garden. I watched the fish circle. I sipped my drink. Bridget came and stood with me for a while, and we didn't talk much, and that was fine. We've never needed to fill silence. About an hour in, Francesca was at a small round table with two of her sisters, and they were laughing about something. I was maybe 6 feet behind them, and they hadn't noticed me. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just walking back from the bar. In Italian, one of the sisters said something about Bridget's dress. Francesca laughed and said also in Italian, "What did you expect? She's from Ohio. They sell those at the supermarket." The third sister said, "And the father? My God, he looks like a retired bus driver." "He probably was," Francesca said. "Hayden won't say what he did. He just says business. Imagine the kind of business a man from Ohio is in." They laughed again. I walked past them without breaking stride. I didn't look at them. I didn't change my expression. I went back to the koi pond and I watched the fish and I drank my Prosecco and I made a decision. I wasn't going to say a word, not yet. The wedding was scheduled for 6 months later, a destination affair on Lake Como. The Marchetti Vances were paying for the bulk of it, which they made very clear in the way they offered. They had also, Hayden told me one night on the phone, suggested a modest contribution from our side. The number they'd suggested was $35,000. Hayden had been quiet on the line for a long time after he said it. "Grandpa, I told them no. I told them I'd pay it myself if it came to that." "But how much do you have saved, son?" A pause. "About 9,000. I closed my eyes. "About 9,000. I closed my eyes. I was sitting in my recliner, the television on mute, a basketball game I wasn't watching. I could hear my refrigerator humming in the kitchen. "I'll cover it," I said. "Grandpa, Hayden, listen to me. I'll cover it. I don't want you starting your marriage in debt to people like that. You understand." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Thank you. I love you. I love you too. Don't tell them where it came from. Tell them you saved it. They'll never believe that. Then tell them whatever you want. Just don't tell them it was me." After we hung up, I sat in the recliner for a long time. I thought about Joanne. I thought about how she would have known exactly what to do and how she would have said it in Italian and how those women would not have laughed at her at any table in any country in the world. The next morning, I called my old friend Eli Bergstrom. Ellie and I had worked together for 15 years at the logistics firm. He'd retired 3 years before me, but he'd kept his hand in. He still consulted. He still knew everyone. "Donovan," he said, "it's been months. How are you?" "Ellie, I need a favor." "Quiet kind. Tell me." "There's a private equity firm in Greenwich, Connecticut, Marchetti Vance Capital. I want to know everything that's public, everything that's quietly known, and anything in between." He didn't ask why. That's the kind of friend Eli is. He just said, "Give me a week." It took him 9 days. What Eli sent me in a thick manila envelope delivered by overnight courier was a portrait of a man in trouble. Roberto Marchetti Vance had spent the past 4 years aggressively buying up small and mid-sized machine tool manufacturers across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. He'd been levering them up, stripping them down, and trying to flip the assets to larger conglomerates. The strategy had worked twice. It had failed the last 3 times. He was carrying significant debt, and 2 of his backers, the kind of names you don't want walking away from you, were rumored to be looking for an exit. I read the file twice. Then I made another phone call. Marcus Whitestone was a name I hadn't said out loud in 12 years. He'd been my counterpart at a competitor in Detroit, and we'd done a handful of deals together back when he was just starting to build what would become one of the larger holding companies in the industrial Midwest. He was richer than God now. He was also, if memory served, exactly the kind of man who'd see opportunity in a struggling Greenwich PE shop. His secretary put me through within 2 minutes. "Donovan Reese," he said. "I'll be damned. I thought you were dead." "Not yet, Marcus. What's the occasion?" I've got a name for you. Tell me if you want me to keep talking or hang up. Shoot. Marchetti Vance Capital, Greenwich. A long pause. Keep talking, he said. I told him what I knew. I didn't tell him why I was telling him. I didn't have to. Marcus is the kind of man who can smell a wounded animal from 3 states away, and he didn't need me to draw him a map. Donovan, he said when I was done, I owe you for this. You want a finder's fee? No. Nothing? One thing. When you make your move, I want to know the week before. That's all. Done. I hung up the phone. I went out to the garage. I tinkered with the carburetor on my old Ford pickup for 3 hours, just so I'd have something to do with my hands. Months passed. Hayden and Julia were busy with wedding plans. I sent the $35,000 routed through Hayden so it looked like his. I flew out to Cincinnati twice to take him to lunch. He seemed happy enough. He talked about the wedding. He talked about Julia's parents the way a man talks about weather he can't change. In May, 3 weeks before the wedding, Marcus Whitestone called me. Donovan, next Wednesday. Understood. You sure you don't want anything? I'm sure. Hell of a man, he said. I'm sure. Hell of a man, he said. Hell of a man. The wedding was that Saturday. Bridget and I flew over together, business class, which I paid for myself. Hayden had offered to cover it, and I'd refused. I wanted nothing tangled in this from the Marchetti Vance side, not 1 penny. Lake Como was beautiful. I'll give them that. The villa they'd rented out for the weekend sat on a hillside above the water with cypress trees and a gravel drive and a wide stone terrace where the rehearsal dinner was set. The light off the lake in the evening turned everything the color of old gold. The rehearsal dinner was on Friday night. I wore the suit I'd had made in Milan in 1989. It still fit. Joanne had picked the fabric. The tailor's son had recut the lapels for me before I'd flown out. Bridget told me I looked handsome. I told her she looked like her mother, which made her cry a little, which she pretended she didn't. We sat at a long table on the terrace, maybe 40 people. I was seated near the middle, between Carlo and one of Julia's cousins, a young woman named Allegra, who was polite but uninterested. Across from me sat Francesca and Roberto. 2 seats down from Roberto sat his business partner, a sharp-faced man named Vincenzo, who I gathered ran the European side of the operation. The conversation, predictably, was mostly in Italian. I had been at the table for perhaps 20 minutes when Francesca leaned toward Vincenzo and murmured in Italian, "Look at the old American. He hasn't said a word. I don't think he understands a fork from a knife." Vincenzo glanced at me, smiled at her, and said, "Maybe he's wondering where the McDonald's is." The table laughed. Carlo laughed. Roberto laughed. Even Allegra, beside me, gave a small, embarrassed smile and looked down at her plate. They thought it was the height of cleverness. They thought I was a piece of furniture. I lifted my wine. I tasted it. It was a Barolo, and it was very good. I set it down and I cut my veal, and I ate, and I said nothing. A few minutes later, Francesca leaned over to her sister Bianca, who had flown in from Rome, and said in Italian, "Hayden could have done so much better. Julia is too good for that family. The grandfather, my God, he smells like a garage." Bianca said, "Be kind, Francesca." "He's old. Old and poor," Francesca said. "Worst combination." I caught Bridget's eye across the table. She was sitting near the inn with Hayden's college roommate. She gave me a small, concerned look, the kind a daughter gives a father when she thinks he might be lonely in a crowd. I gave her a small smile back that I hoped told her I was fine. The dinner went on. The toasts began. Roberto stood up and gave a long speech in English about family and tradition and the merging of 2 great houses, by which he meant his house. Francesca followed with something shorter but pointier, talking about how proud she was of Julia, even with everything she's taking on. Hayden stood up next, and he was nervous, but he was good. He talked about his mother and about me. He said, "My grandfather Donovan raised me as much as my mother did. He taught me everything I know about being a man. If I become half of what he is, I'll have done well." Francesca's smile during that toast was the tightest thing I have ever seen on a human face. When Hayden sat down, Roberto looked at me from across the table. "Donovan," he said in English, "perhaps you would like to say something?" "In English, of course. We wouldn't want to trouble you." The table tittered. I set down my napkin. I stood up slowly. I'm not a small man, even at 67. I straightened my jacket. I picked up my glass, and then, in Italian, I said, "Thank you, Roberto. I'll try not to trouble anyone." The table went completely silent. I continued in Italian. I said, "I would like to thank our hosts for this beautiful evening. The wine is excellent. The 2015 Barolo, if I'm not mistaken. I had the same vintage at a small restaurant in Alba 2 summers ago, with a man who was kind enough to walk me through his vineyards. The food has been wonderful. The setting is unforgettable. The setting is unforgettable." Nobody at the table moved. I said, "I would like to say a few words about my grandson, Hayden. He is the finest young man I know. He was raised by my daughter Bridget, who is the finest woman I know, and who is sitting at the end of this table in a dress I happen to know she bought at a department store in Columbus, Ohio, because she wanted to look nice tonight, and because she cannot be more out of place at a table where her dress is being measured by people who have never measured anything that mattered in their lives." I heard a sharp intake of breath from Francesca. I did not look at her. I said, "I have lived a long life. I lived 11 years in Milan. I buried my wife in 1998. She was Sicilian on her mother's side, and she taught me that the Italian language is the most beautiful in the world, and that the people who speak it are the most generous in the world. I have spent 40 years believing that. I would like to continue believing that. But tonight at this table, I have heard things in Italian about my daughter and about myself that have tested that belief considerably." The silence was unbearable. Allegra, beside me, was staring at her plate as if she wished she could climb inside it. I said, "I am not going to repeat what I heard. There are children in this house. I will say only that the speakers know what they said, and they know that I heard it, and they know now that I understood every word." I raised my glass. I said in Italian, "To my grandson Hayden, to my daughter Bridget, and to the truth which always arrives, late but always." I drank. I sat down. For a long moment no one moved. Then Hayden stood up at his end of the table, and he was crying, and he raised his glass, and he said, "To Grandpa." Bridget stood up next. Then Allegra beside me stood up. She was the first one on that side of the family to stand. She said very softly, "To Donovan." A few others followed. Most did not. Roberto looked like he'd been slapped. Francesca's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Vincenzo was staring at his plate. I finished my dinner. I had dessert. I had coffee. I made small talk with Allegra, who asked me, in halting English, where I had learned my Italian, and I told her about Joanne, and her eyes filled up a little. When the dinner ended, I walked back to my room. Bridget walked with me. She held my arm the whole way and didn't say a word. The wedding the next day was a quiet affair by comparison. Francesca did not look at me. Roberto shook my hand at the reception with the kind of grip that wasn't checking for a wince anymore. Hayden hugged me 3 times. Julia, to her credit, kissed my cheek and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Grandpa. I didn't know. I should have known." I told her she was now my granddaughter, and that was that. The flight home was Monday. On Wednesday, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was Hayden. "Grandpa, did you see the news?" "What news?" "Roberto's firm. They've been bought out. Some holding company out of Detroit. The board pushed Roberto out yesterday. He's being told to liquidate his personal stake at a loss. I sipped my coffee. The light through the kitchen window was soft and yellow. The morning paper was on the counter, unread. "That's a shame," I said. There was a long pause on the line. "Grandpa." "Yes, son." "Did you have anything to do with that?" I thought for a moment. I thought about how to answer. I thought about Joanne and what she would have wanted me to say. I said, "Hayden, I want you to listen to me carefully. A man can spend his whole life being underestimated and never do anything about it. That's a fine way to live. Or he can spend his whole life being underestimated and let the underestimating roll right past him until the day someone hurts the people he loves. Then he does what needs to be done. He doesn't brag. He doesn't explain. He doesn't take a bow. He just makes sure the lesson lands where it needs to land, and then he goes home and feeds his cat." Hayden was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Grandpa, you don't have a cat." "I might get one," I said. He laughed for a long time. And then he said, "I love you. I love you too. How's Julia?" Embarrassed, furious with her parents, confused, grateful, all of it. "She'll be fine. She's a good girl. She just had to see her parents the way the rest of us saw them. Sometimes that takes a wedding. Sometimes that takes a grandfather," he said. I didn't answer that one. I just drank my coffee and watched the light move across the kitchen floor, and I thought about Joanne and how she would have laughed. I did get a cat, actually, about a month later. Small gray thing from the shelter. She has one ear that doesn't quite stand up, and she sleeps on my chest when I read in the recliner at night. I named her Como. Hayden and Julia visit twice a year. Bridget comes for Sunday dinner most weeks. Roberto and Francesca I have not seen. I do not expect to. From what I hear, they sold the house in Greenwich and moved somewhere smaller in Florida. Hayden tells me Francesca tried to call once and apologize about a year after the wedding, and Julia listened to the voicemail twice and then deleted it. I think about that night on the terrace sometimes, when I'm sitting on my back porch in the summer evenings. I think about the look on Francesca's face when I started speaking. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy it. I'm 67 years old, not a saint, but mostly what I think about is this. There's a kind of quiet a man earns when he spends his whole life listening more than he talks. People mistake it for weakness. They mistake it for stupidity, or for age, or for not having anything to say. They don't realize that the man who's been quietest in the room is usually the one who's heard the most, and the one who's heard the most is usually the one who decides, in the end, how the story finishes. My wife knew that. She used to tell me in Italian that the wise man speaks last because he's the only one who knows what the conversation was actually about. I miss her every day, but I'd like to think that night on the terrace, somewhere, she was watching. And I'd like to think she was smiling. That's the whole story. That's what happened to me and to my grandson and to a family that thought a man from Ohio in a department store suit wasn't worth speaking carefully around. If you're an older person watching this and someone in your life has decided that your quiet means your weakness, I want you to remember something. You have lived a whole life. You have learned things they cannot imagine. The day will come when they need to know it. And on that day, you decide. You can stay quiet, and that is a kind of dignity. Or you can speak in whatever language they didn't expect and let them understand exactly who they have been sitting across from all along. Either way, you go home and you feed your cat and you sleep well, because the truth always arrives. Late, but always. I've thought about that night on the terrace more times than I can count, and the older I get, the more I realize the lesson wasn't about Italian, or about money, or even about Francesca and Roberto getting what was coming to them. The lesson was about cause and effect. Every choice a person makes plants a seed, and every seed eventually shows what it was. Francesca chose, for years, to measure people by what they wore and where they were from. She chose to laugh at a quiet old man at her own daughter's engagement party. She chose, again, at the rehearsal dinner. Those choices didn't fall on me. They fell on her. I didn't break her family's empire. I just made one phone call to a man who already smelled the smoke, the fire she'd been setting under her own house for years. What I want any older person hearing this to understand is that dignity isn't loud. It isn't the man at the head of the table giving the toast in 3 languages. It's the man at the middle of the table who's been listening, really listening, for 40 years. I spent my whole career being the quietest man in the room, and I learned more in those silences than most people learn in a lifetime of talking. There's a strength in that quiet. It's not weakness. It's not surrender. It's a kind of patience that the world doesn't reward you for until the moment it suddenly does. I think about Hayden and how proud I was when he stood up that night and raised his glass to me. He didn't need the speech I gave to know who I was. He'd known since he was 9 years old, sitting on my workbench while I fixed his bike chain. But Bridget needed to see it. She'd spent her whole adult life apologizing for being from Ohio, in rooms where she shouldn't have had to apologize for anything. And that night, she got to watch her father stand up and refuse to apologize for either of us. That mattered more to me than anything Francesca lost in the boardroom. If there's any wisdom I've earned, it's this: be decent to people you think you're above. Because one day the bus driver across the table is going to turn out to have spent 11 years in Milan, and your whole life will pivot on the fact that you couldn't be bothered to speak kindly when you thought no one was listening. The world is full of quiet people who heard you. Some of them forgive you, some of them don't. Most of them just walk away and let your own choices catch up with you, which they always do in their own time. I'm 67. I have a cat named Como. I have a daughter who calls every Sunday and a grandson with a wife who learned, eventually, who her mother really was. That's enough. That's more than enough. And every now and then, when the light is just right on the back porch, I lift a glass to Joanne, and I think about how she would have laughed at that terrace. And I know I did right by her name.